In a way, movement is inherent to how video games are played. Entire genres are defined by how the player moves around the environment. Movement allows a player to control anything, from a character, to vehicles, to even entire armies in real time. In some games, movement is rather basic and streamlined, whereas in others, it's an intricate skill that takes thousands of hours to master. I would wager to say that every game, from Space Invaders to Cyberpunk, involves some variation of player movement. However, most games these days feature a standard walk and sprint system that can get tiresome after a while. Since how the player gets around in games is integral to designing them, it's safe to say that developers have come up with some more interesting ways to get around over the years. In my experience, these movement systems usually fall into one of three categories, what I'll call the three M's of movement design. These three are momentum, maneuverability, and might. One way developers can make a series of player movements feel impactful is through the implementation of momentum. While the majority of games choose to have the player moving at a constant walking speed, it can lead to boredom and lack of engagement because there's no skill or excitement involved. A game that famously bucks this trend is the most recent Spider-Man game. Very rarely outside of fights will the player be grounded in the game. Instead, Spider-Man introduces its web-slinging system as the very first mechanic players use in the game, showing how fun and integral the devs thought it was to their design. This system is able to stay as simple to use as standard walking because of how it uses one button to control the swings. And though it's simple to control, web swinging can be difficult to master because of the addition of momentum. Spider-Man allows the player to build momentum while web swinging through New York through precise timing of button presses which build up Spidey's speed if he lets go of one web and shoots the next at the high point of his arc. The base system of swinging between skyscrapers is added onto through the use of a web zip, which can launch Spider-Man forward in between web swings. The momentum gained from a web zip is increased if the player zips to a specific point and hits a button at the exact point of landing to propel off the point in a fast-paced leap. By combining the web swing and zip abilities with simpler ones like whipping around corners and wall running, maximizing momentum while traveling in Spider-Man becomes a game of its own, with as many tricks to master as the game's combat itself. A sort of precursor to the modern Spider-Man game can be found in Saints Row 4. In addition to being focused on using superhero powers in an open world like Spider-Man, Saints Row 4 also shares the same value of momentum in its movement system. Traversal abilities include super speed, leaping, and gliding, which can be chained together so rapidly that it makes moving around in older Saints Row games feel sluggish by comparison. In those games, if there was an objective on the other end of the map, the fastest way to get there would be to call in a sports car or motorcycle and dash in and out of traffic. Saints Row 4 does away with relying on street layouts and NPC drivers by allowing players to run up buildings and jump off them to glide to the next building and rinse and repeat. The ability to gain more momentum than a hot rod could ever dream of feels liberating and exciting as the player tries to optimize the timing on their jumps and glides. In this way, Saints Row 4 is like Spider-Man, as it offers a set of tools to the player which they can choose to manipulate to build momentum, something that is simply not possible in traditional movement systems which rely on sprinting and driving. Focusing on maneuverability in movement can be a useful alternative to momentum, and potentially can lead to deeper and more engaging gameplay. A good example of such a system is the pilot movement in the Titanfall games. Since the Titans in these games are so massive and powerful, it was necessary for the games to move past a standard run-and-gun movement system so that players that were not in Titans could compete effectively. The result is movement that feels very different from a typical first-person shooter, as it combines traditional mechanics like sprinting and sliding with abilities more common in platformers like double jumps and wall running. Though it may take a bit to get used to, even for experienced FPS players, the dynamism of Titanfall's movement system can allow them to utilize the varying heights in the game's map layouts to take down enemy pilots and Titans alike. Another game where the use of maneuverability and movement directly translates to success is My Friend Pedro. Here, the player is tasked with moving through a 2D platformer while dispatching enemies as quickly and stylishly as possible. Movement consists of rolling, diving, and flipping off of everything in the environment, including enemies themselves. The player can quickly get into a free-flowing state where they wall jump to enter an area and flip around enemies as they find the most efficient way to maneuver around the location and maximize their score. The goal of a high score is key to placing emphasis on skilled maneuvers, because running into enemies and mistiming jumps will slow down the player, reducing their score at the end of the level. The score serves to motivate players to master the movement system of My Friend Pedro by exploring all of the possible methods they can use to maneuver around its levels. Some interesting movement systems don't rely on momentum or maneuverability at all. Instead, they simply rely on empowering the player, typically through the control of some sort of larger vehicle or animal. For instance, the Titans of the aforementioned Titanfall series do an excellent job of making the player feel like a force to be reckoned with. Moving in a Titan feels slower than the typical pilot walking speed and considerably slower than an agile pilot. But what Titans lack in speed, they make up for in brute force. Titans shake the UI and vibrate the player's controller as they move, giving them a physical sense of their massive power. As they jump into the air and land on the ground, the result is a loud crash that sounds like a meteor impact, further adding to the sense of increased weight and strength. Finally, as they come into contact with enemies, Titans can simply walk over smaller opponents to kill them, rather than bothering to use their weapons at all. This last point is the most interesting to me, as it utilizes gameplay to empower the player, and not just visuals and sound. The anticipation leading up to getting in a Titan has as much to do with how strong it feels to move around in one, as it does with its destructive arsenal of weapons itself. Many of the same features can be found in Far Cry Primal, where the player can ride a variety of creatures from fast-paced wolves to large, hulking woolly mammoths. The mammoths in particular add a feeling of might and weight to gameplay. First and foremost, the ability to ride mammoths is placed deep in the skill tree, giving players a goal to strive for as they progress through the game. Once they unlock the skill, it's quickly emphasized how impactful these woolly friends can be. Mammoths are unlike any other mount in the game because of their large health pool and ability to bash enemies and objects. This effectively turns the player into a prehistoric tank, which can churn through enemy encampments with ease as they hurl spears and launch arrows from the top of the massive beast. As in Titanfall, the mammoth can crush enemies under its feet, which greatly contributes to the sense of power brought on by taming such a large animal. There are several examples of other games with interesting ways to get around, in addition to the ones I've already talked about here. Two that come to mind are Mirror's Edge, which focuses on maneuverability throughout its parkour-based levels, and Sunset Overdrive, which places more emphasis on momentum as players can pick up speed by skating on anything they can find in the environment. Once you start noticing their nuances, these three core concepts of engaging movement can be found in a lot of different game genres. Momentum-based movement systems give players a set of abilities which give players the option to traverse large environments quickly. These systems are more commonly seen in open-world games, where players have more space to practice and demonstrate their mastery of momentum. Movement systems which emphasize maneuverability make the player adaptable to a variety of different scenarios and obstacles, and usually have a deep skill potential. Maneuverability is a core movement mechanic in games that have a high replayability, like multiplayer shooters and score-based games, where players can practice and adapt to a variety of different situations. Finally, might, or a sense of power, is central to movement systems where the fun comes not from mechanical mastery, but the reward of gaining access to a more powerful variation of the player character. These systems are more commonly seen in single-player games where balance is not as much of an issue, though they can be successfully applied to multiplayer arenas as well, as evidenced by the Titanfall series. And although it seems like traditional run-and-gun games are here to stay, the development and success of games with new systems in recent years seems to point to there being much more innovation in store for the field of game movement in the future.